I stood there frozen, the probate envelope trembling in my hand as the seal split with a sharp snap. The kitchen clock ticked too loud, mocking the silence that followed each line I read. The garage is now yours. Just 10 words, cold and bureaucratic, but they landed like a blow. After 24 years of marriage, after nights spent wondering what he was hiding, after burying him with questions still lodged in my throat, I was left with a garage I never wanted, and secrets I wasn't ready to find. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The envelope lay on the kitchen table like a verdict. Sandra Monroe had turned it over in her hands 3 times, as though the weight of her late husband's signature might burn through the paper. She finally slid it open, the probate office seal breaking with a dry snap. The words were blunt, bureaucratic, utterly unsentimental. The garage was now hers. Her breath caught. She pressed the papers flat against the table, eyes tracing the legal phrasing. Every line carried his absence. No explanations, no notes from beyond, just ownership. From across the room, Riley's voice sliced in. A scrap heap, he muttered, leaning against the fridge like the outcome was obvious. His tone was casual, but his eyes gleamed with annoyance. Let it rot, Sandra. Nobody wants that dump. He didn't even look at the documents, just shoved his hands in his pockets like they weren't worth reading. Sandra folded the papers neatly, refusing to let him see the flicker of sting. It's mine now, she said softly, almost to herself. Riley snorted. You'll see. That place is nothing but rust. He grabbed his jacket, the door slamming behind him with a sharp finality. The house felt heavier when he was gone. Sandra slipped the documents into her purse, held her keys a little tighter than usual, and walked out. The drive through Detroit was gray, streets wet from last night's rain. Familiar intersections blurred into a haze of brick warehouses and faded billboards. Sandra gripped the wheel, her mind pulling backward. Every fight she and her husband had about the garage, every time he brushed her questions aside. Just a side project, he'd say. Nothing more. But now, the title in her name said otherwise. She turned onto the narrow street where the garage sat. Her stomach knotted. It looked worse than she remembered, worse even than Riley's mocking description. The building sagged against the skyline like an exhausted old man. Its brick walls were tattooed with graffiti, the paint sun-bleached and peeling. A chain, orange with rust, hung loose across the side door. Weeds clawed through cracks in the pavement. Windows were scabbed with grime, shards missing. Sandra parked, engine ticking into silence. The neighborhood was still, except for a dog barking 2 blocks away. She stepped out, her shoes crunching on broken glass. The garage loomed before her, an inheritance that felt more like a dare. She touched the cold chain, unhooked it with effort. The hinges whined when she pushed the side door, a long metallic groan that echoed into the cavernous dark. The smell hit her instantly, thick, oily, layered with dust and something older. Not rot exactly, but time itself, the kind of smell that clung to fabric, skin, memory. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Shafts of light pierced through cracks in the roof, illuminating swirls of dust that danced with every breath she took. Tools lay scattered across benches like soldiers abandoned mid-battle. Tires leaned against the wall in crooked stacks. And then she saw it. At the far end of the garage, something massive loomed under a tarp. The fabric was gray, stiff with age, its edges dragging along the floor. It wasn't just a pile of junk. It was deliberate, shaped, waiting. Sandra took a hesitant step closer, the hollow thud of her shoes echoing. Her pulse quickened, heartbeats syncing with the distant drip of water somewhere in the shadows. Her hand lifted instinctively, then stopped midair. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Whatever lay beneath that tarp would change this inheritance from a burden into something else. The air seemed to hum with silence, as though the garage itself was holding its breath. Sandra let hers out slowly, eyes fixed on the covered shape. "I don't know what you left me," she whispered into the dark, voice trembling. "But I'm about to find out." She reached for the tarp. The tarp resisted her pull at first, stiff from years of dust and neglect. Sandra gave it a harder tug, the sound of fabric dragging across metal loud enough to echo in the cavernous garage. She stumbled back as the sheet collapsed in a heap, her eyes widening. There it was, a 1969 Dodge Daytona. Cherry red, its paint unblemished as though time had politely stepped aside for this single machine. The sleek nose cone jutted forward like an arrow, the towering rear wing commanding presence even in the half-light. Dust had settled on the hood, sure, but beneath it, the car looked impossibly alive. Sandra pressed a hand to her mouth. She had expected rust, maybe a forgotten shell, but not this. Not perfection. Her phone felt slippery in her hands as she fumbled for it, snapping a photo almost without thinking. The camera shutter sounded small against the enormity of what she'd uncovered. She sent it to Maggie before she could talk herself out of it. The phone barely buzzed once before Maggie's voice came shrieking through the speaker. "Holy hell! Sandra, do you know what you're looking at? That car's worth more than your house, maybe 2 houses." Sandra turned in a slow circle, as if to confirm she was still standing in her husband's garage, still breathing the thick mix of oil and dust. "You're kidding." "I'd never kid about a Daytona," Maggie shot back. Her voice softened, but only slightly. "Why didn't he tell you he had this? People wait lifetimes to even see one up close." Sandra had no answer. Her chest tightened. He'd never mentioned it, never even hinted. And yet, here it sat, humming with silent history. She lowered herself into the driver's seat, the vinyl cool beneath her palms. The interior smelled faintly of leather and gasoline, cleaner than anything else in the garage. On the passenger seat, a manila folder rested neatly, as though placed there deliberately. She stared at it a moment, unease crawling up her spine, before reaching for it. The tab was labeled in her husband's careful handwriting. Project Road King. Sandra flipped it open. Inside were photographs. Her husband beside the car at different stages, each one dated, each showing progress she'd never been told about. Next came blueprints, delicate lines sketched with precision, annotated with notes in the margins. And then, near the back, a typed appraisal sheet bearing a staggering number. She read it twice before the ink felt real. Her hand trembled as she set the papers back in her lap. This wasn't a hobby. It was a secret. A world her husband had lived in without her, all the while dismissing her questions with a shrug and a smile. Her phone buzzed again. Maggie had texted this time. "Don't let Riley near that thing." Sandra closed her eyes, the weight of the folder pressing down. Why had he hidden this from her? Why not share the excitement, the legacy, the sheer worth of it all? She looked again at the photographs. In one, he was younger. Grease streaked across his cheek, but his eyes? They glowed with something fierce, something private. In another, Dana Carter stood beside him, both grinning, the car only half assembled in the background. Sandra's stomach sank. Had Dana known too? She set the folder back on the dash, her fingers lingering on the word project. He hadn't called it a car. He'd called it a project. Unfinished, intentional, something larger than the machine itself. A sound carried through the still garage, the faint creak of metal settling. Sandra startled, clutching the folder tighter, the silence after louder than the noise itself. The place felt less like an empty shell now, and more like a locked room she'd trespassed into. Her gaze drifted back to the car's windshield, where the thin layer of dust traced the words her husband had once scrawled with a finger. Soon. Sandra swallowed hard. Soon for whom? The folder trembled in her lap. She pressed it shut, heart pounding with the weight of secrets buried in steel and silence. And then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed something she hadn't before. Another shape, smaller, tucked beneath the far workbench. Covered too. Waiting. Sandra barely had time to process what she'd uncovered before Riley barged through the kitchen door the next morning. He didn't knock, didn't pause, just stomped in with the force of someone who already believed he was owed something. His eyes burned, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke clung to his jacket. "You think you're slick, don't you?" he snapped, tossing a crumpled printout onto the table. A blurry photo of the Dodge Daytona filled the page, clearly lifted from a screenshot. "Word's already out. That car? That's mine." Sandra froze. She hadn't told him, which meant someone else had run their mouth. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe Maggie's post had traveled farther than she realized. Either way, Riley knew, and there was no putting the secret back in its box. He leaned in, voice hot with entitlement. "I helped build it. Years ago, when Dad was still around. I held the damn wrench, Sandra. Don't you dare pretend you know what that car means." Her pulse hammered, but she forced herself to stand taller. The folder from the garage sat upstairs in her room, locked away. Proof. Ownership. Intent. She met Riley's glare with a calmness she barely felt. "The title's in my name," she said evenly. "You want to fight it? You'll lose." His face twisted, the entitled boy beneath the 30-something exterior flashing through like a crack in plaster. He shoved the chair back so hard it screeched across the floor. "You're just a stepmom," he spat, the words venom-coated. "Don't fool yourself into thinking you're family." The silence after was heavier than his accusation. Sandra's fingers curled against her palm, not because his words weren't sharp, but because she knew they were the kind of weapon he believed he could win with. "Get out," she said quietly. For a second, he hesitated, perhaps expecting her to waver, to soften. When she didn't, he slammed the door so violently the glass panes rattled. Sandra exhaled, steadying her shaking hands before she reached for the phone. "Mrs. Monroe." Lamar Fitch's measured baritone came through the receiver, steady as stone. He had been her husband's probate attorney for years, formal, unhurried, a man who weighed his words like coins. "Lamar," she began, her voice cracking despite her efforts. "Riley's making claims about the garage, about the car inside it. He says he worked on it. He thinks it belongs to him." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "I'll be blunt, Sandra. The documents are airtight. Full legal ownership of the garage and its contents passed to you. Whatever Riley claims about his labor has no standing." Sandra closed her eyes, relief trickling in like sunlight through blinds. Still, Lamar wasn't finished. "You'll need to be vigilant. If he feels cornered, he might act rashly. I suggest securing the garage and keeping your discovery quiet. For now." Her gaze drifted toward the manila folder resting on her desk upstairs. Keeping it quiet had already failed once. Still, Lamar's tone gave her something she hadn't had in days. Certainty. "Thank you," she whispered. "Call me the moment he tries anything else," Lamar said, before the line clicked dead. That night, Sandra sat with her laptop open, the glow of the screen painting her living room in cold light. Her fingers hovered over the keys, then began typing. 1969 Dodge Daytona value. Dodge Daytona auction record. Rare muscle cars. Detroit. Page after page appeared. Auction results in the six figures. Articles celebrating the model's racing legacy. Even video clips of collectors marveling at the car's engineering. Each new tab widened the chasm between what she thought she'd inherited and what it truly was. She clicked on a forum thread where collectors discussed a handful of Dionas still unaccounted for. One comment caught her eye. If anyone finds one untouched, it's a gold mine. A legacy piece. Legacy. The word seared through her. Not Riley's. Not Dana's. Hers. Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. I heard you've got something special in that garage. We should talk. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. The next morning, the garage smelled different. Warmer somehow, like fresh coffee fighting through layers of grease and dust. Sandra blinked at the unexpected sight. Dana Carter. Perched on a stool by the workbench, a cardboard drink tray balanced in one hand and a rolled set of blueprints tucked under her arm. Figured you'd be here, Dana said, sliding one of the cups toward Sandra. Black. No sugar. Still your poison, right? Sandra accepted it cautiously, the heat biting against her palms. Dana. What are you doing here? Instead of answering, Dana laid the blueprints across the scarred workbench, flattening them with practiced hands. Your husband and I. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the covered Dodge like it was listening. We weren't just restoring that Daytona. There was more. Sandra's stomach tightened. More? Dana smoothed out the paper. Intricate sketches spread across the page, lines, curves, notations Sandra couldn't begin to decipher. The heading at the top read simply, Superbird Prototype. Sandra leaned closer. This isn't the Daytona. No, Dana said quietly. This is rarer, almost mythical. We started it years ago before he got sick. Parts of it are still here, hidden, boxed, tucked under shelves. We never got far enough to finish. Sandra moved slowly, eyes scanning the shadowed edges of the garage. She crouched beside a row of shelves, tugging at a dusty crate. The cardboard gave a protesting squeal as she slid it out. Inside, beneath layers of newspaper, gleamed a set of engine parts, intact, gleaming faintly despite years in the dark. Her fingers traced the metal, cold and smooth, carrying the unmistakable weight of intention. He kept all of this from me, she murmured. Dana didn't soften. Not from you. For you. Sandra snapped her gaze up. Don't romanticize it, Dana. He could have said something. He had years. Dana's jaw flexed, but her tone remained steady. He didn't, because he knew Riley. He knew the vultures that circle when they smell money. He wanted someone steady. Someone who wouldn't flip it for a quick check. That was always you, Sandra, whether you realize it or not. The words cut deeper than Sandra expected. She set the part back in the box, careful not to let it clang. Even if that's true, I don't belong in this world. Car expos, collectors, it's all chrome and ego. That's not me. Dana's eyes softened, but only for a second. Then her voice sharpened, like steel being honed. It is now. You don't get to decide whether you're in this world. You've already inherited it. The question is, what you do with it. Sandra took a sip of her coffee, bitter on her tongue, grounding her in reality. The garage was quiet except for the occasional drip of water in the corner. She looked at the sketches again, her husband's careful notations mixed with Dana's blockier handwriting, arrows and numbers crisscrossing the page like veins, a map of something unfinished, pulsing with expectation. Her chest tightened with a mix of grief and something she couldn't quite name. Was it responsibility? Fear? Possibility? Maybe all three. She turned toward the gleaming Dodge, silent in its corner, and then back to the parts half hidden in shadows. 2 cars, 2 legacies, one finished, one waiting. Sandra exhaled slowly. If I go through with this, if I even consider it, I'll need help. Dana's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then it's a good thing I came prepared. She tapped the blueprints, then pointed to the crate Sandra had opened. Because this isn't just about finishing a car. It's about finishing a promise. He wanted to reveal it at the Detroit Collectors Expo. Big stage, big audience. He wanted the world to know what he built. Sandra's breath caught at the word promise. It pressed heavy against her chest. The blueprints rustled faintly in the stale air, as if they themselves were restless, waiting. Sandra's phone lit up with a notification late that afternoon, an alert from a collector's forum she'd been lurking on for days. Her blood ran cold at the subject line. 1969 Dodge Daytona. Private listing, Detroit. She clicked it. The photo was unmistakable. The sharp red nose cone, the distinctive wing, her husband's car. Her car. And underneath, the seller's name, Riley Monroe. Sandra gripped the desk so hard her knuckles whitened. The gall of it, the speed with which he'd moved, like a thief racing daylight. She dialed Lamar before her panic could take root. "He's listing it," she blurted as soon as he picked up. "Riley. He's trying to sell it out from under me." Lamar didn't sound surprised, only grim. "Send me the listing. Now." She forwarded it with trembling fingers, the seconds stretching unbearably while Lamar reviewed it. Then his voice came firm, decisive. "It's illegal. You're the title holder. I'll file an emergency cease and desist." 2 hours later, Sandra stood just outside the sleek glass facade of an uptown auction house, her pulse thrumming like a second heartbeat. Lamar emerged with a leather folio tucked beneath his arm, his expression unreadable until he reached her. "They've received the paperwork," he said. "The sale won't go forward." "Not legally." Sandra exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening, but only barely. Because she knew Riley wouldn't retreat quietly. She was right. By evening, her phone buzzed non-stop. Facebook notifications piled in, Riley's ranting posts spreading like wildfire. His words blazed on the screen, vindictive, bitter. "Trying to erase my father's legacy because she can't stand that I was part of it. She's just a stepmom with no right to his bloodline." Sandra's throat closed, bile rising. Dozens of comments flooded below, some siding with him, some not. But one response cut sharp through the noise. Maggie Ruiz, never one to mince words. "She owns it. End of story. Try working an honest job for once, Riley." Sandra almost laughed, a choked, grateful sound. Maggie's loyalty burned hotter than Riley's spite, steadying Sandra in a way she hadn't realized she needed. Still, the post rattled her. She shut the laptop, retreating to the garage where the smell of oil and dust felt safer than the digital storm. Dana was already there, sleeves rolled, pen tucked behind her ear, crouched by a shelf of old boxes. She glanced up when Sandra entered. "Auctions canceled?" Sandra nodded, weary. "For now." "Good." Dana returned to her work. "Then let's get serious. If Riley wants chaos, we need inventory, documentation, proof of everything in here, every bolt, every blueprint. It'll make it harder for him to argue later." Together, they began cataloging. Sandra scribbled notes while Dana called out each item: carburetors, crankshafts, crates of tools older than Sandra's marriage. The garage transformed from a graveyard into a ledger of value, piece by piece. Sandra knelt near a workbench shoved against the back wall, wiping sweat from her brow. She tugged at a drawer that stuck, finally forcing it open with a screech. Inside, brittle rags, a cracked wrench, and something metallic wedged flat against the back. Her fingers scraped it free. A small plate, no larger than her palm, coated in dust and grease. She rubbed it with her sleeve, and the numbers stamped into the steel came clear. A VIN plate. Dana's head snapped up. "What did you just find?" Sandra handed it over, pulse racing. Dana's eyes widened as she scanned the digits, her face blanching, then flushing with heat. "This isn't from the Daytona." She swallowed hard. "It's from a 1970 Plymouth Superbird, prototype model." Sandra blinked. "Prototype?" There are maybe 3 in existence, Dana whispered, her voice reverent, almost fearful. And if this plate is here, that means somewhere, somehow, the rest of it exists too. The air in the garage thickened, the weight of possibility pressing against them both. Sandra's grip tightened on her notebook, her earlier exhaustion vanishing. Her husband hadn't just hidden a car, he'd hidden a ghost. Dana turned the VN plate over in her hands as though it might vanish if she blinked too long. Sandra, she said softly, reverently, there are maybe 3 of these in the world. Collectors argue if the prototypes even survived at all. And you, she tapped the plate with her thumb. You're holding proof. Sandra's throat felt dry. The metal weighed more than it should, its history pressing down on her like a stone. For years she'd thought the garage was just a burden, a pile of rust. Now it seemed every corner held a secret her husband had tucked away, waiting for her to uncover. She set the plate carefully on the workbench and met Dana's gaze. Then we finish it. Dana blinked. Sandra. No. Sandra cut in, firmer this time than she'd intended. He started something, and I won't let Riley, or anyone, twist it into cash and bragging rights. If this car exists, if the pieces are here, I'm going to see it through. I owe him that much. For a moment, silence hung thick between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic outside. Then Dana nodded slowly, her lips curving into something almost like relief. Then we'll need a team. 2 weeks later, the garage was alive again. Sandra had dipped into the savings she'd once earmarked for roof repairs and a retirement trip she'd never taken. Instead, she'd quietly hired 2 veteran restorers Dana trusted, men who had grease permanently etched under their fingernails and reverence in their eyes when they saw the blueprints. Never thought I'd touch one of these, one whispered, cradling a rusted fender like it was porcelain. Sandra stayed close as they worked, scribbling in notebooks, snapping photos, cataloging each part as if proof itself might be the shield she'd need when Riley came clawing again. With every bolt and blueprint, the garage shifted from a mausoleum to a resurrection. And yet, the shadow of Riley never stayed far. One evening, Sandra returned from the hardware store to find an unfamiliar sedan idling across the street. A man in a suit leaned against the hood, briefcase in hand, posture too deliberate to be casual. He intercepted her at the gate. "Mrs. Monroe, I represent your stepson." His voice was smooth, clipped. He extended a business card with Riley's name embossed in black, beneath a downtown law firm's crest. "My client requests access to the property. He believes there may be items of shared sentimental value." Sandra's pulse spiked. There's nothing sentimental about theft. The lawyer didn't flinch, just tucked his card back into his pocket. "Consider this a courtesy visit. The next will be formal." She watched him retreat to his car, her stomach knotting. As the taillights faded, she dialed Lamar with shaking hands. He answered on the second ring. "I assume Riley sent his hounds." Sandra recounted the encounter, her words tumbling fast. Lamar listened without interruption, then said, steady as ever, "He won't touch that garage. I'll draft a motion to reinforce the transfer of ownership, and we'll file for additional protections. Locks, alarms, whatever it takes." "Locks won't stop him if he's desperate," Sandra murmured. "They'll slow him," Lamar replied, "and the law will do the rest." Later that night, Sandra stood alone in the garage, staring at the Dodge and the scattered pieces of the Phantom Superbird. The restorers had left hours ago, tools still glinting under a single hanging bulb. She ran her fingers along the vine plate, cold and stubborn in her palm. Every part of her ached with the weight of Riley's intrusion, the online smears, the lawyer's threats, the memory of his sneer when he called her just a stepmom. But here, surrounded by blueprints and steel, she felt something else building, something harder, sharper. This wasn't just her husband's unfinished car anymore. It was hers. and she would see it to completion no matter who tried to steal it. The garage had begun to sound different at night. Not just the echo of dripping pipes or the occasional creak of old beams, but a hum, faint, like the ghosts of engines long gone. Sandra found herself lingering past midnight, catalog in hand, tracing every corner with her flashlight. That was when the beam caught something odd beneath a stack of tires in the far corner. A metal edge, nearly invisible, flush with the concrete wall. She pulled the tires away one by one, the rubber squealing against the floor. Dust exploded upward, coating her throat. Beneath it, a square steel door emerged, no larger than a suitcase lid, its surface dulled with years of neglect. A safe. Sandra's pulse leapt. Dana arrived minutes later, summoned by a breathless call. Together they wrestled with the lock. Dana knelt close, ears tuned to the tumblers. Sandra held the light steady, every tick and click scratching against her nerves until, finally, a sharp metallic release. The safe yawned open. Inside lay a stack of worn envelopes, each labeled in her husband's script. Beneath them, original pink slips, crisp despite their age, naming cars she recognized and others she didn't. Resting on top was a racing helmet, its white shell streaked with signatures. Sandra tilted it toward the light, and her knees nearly gave. Richard Petty, the king of NASCAR himself. Her hands trembled as she set the helmet aside. Dana whistled low, reverent. Sandra, do you realize what you're holding? This isn't just memorabilia, it's history. But Sandra's attention had snagged on something smaller. A single envelope tucked in the back, edges yellowed, her name etched across the front in a familiar, deliberate hand. She froze. Her breath left her in a rush, tears pricking her eyes before she even tore it open. Inside, the letter was short, written in his unmistakable slant. If you're reading this, I'm gone. This was always yours. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. You'll know what to do. Sandra pressed the paper to her chest, her vision blurring. She could still hear his voice in every loop of ink. The grief she'd locked away for weeks cracked open, raw and overwhelming. Dana laid a hand gently on her shoulder. He knew you'd come here someday. He planned for this, Sandra. He trusted you more than anyone else. Sandra wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, inhaling shakily. Then I can't back down. Not from Riley. Not from anyone. The next day, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. Mrs. Monroe, came a voice smooth as velvet. Victor Choi, I suspect you've heard my name? She had. A collector whose obsession with rare muscle cars bordered on myth. Stories about him floated through every forum she'd scoured, his warehouses lined with gleaming machines, his endless appetite for what others called priceless. I understand you've come into possession of a 1969 Daytona, Victor continued. I don't deal in rumors, so let's speak plainly. I'm prepared to offer you $850,000 for it. Cash, no delays. Sandra gripped the phone tighter. The number stunned her. Nearly $1 million waved like bait. A part of her, a small, practical part, whispered what that money could do. Erase debts, secure her retirement, buy peace. But another part, louder now, remembered the letter. This was always yours. She steadied her voice. It's not for sale. Victor chuckled, low and patient. Everyone says that at first. Think it over. I'll be in touch. The line went dead, leaving Sandra staring at her reflection in the blackened screen. She turned back to the safe, the letter still folded carefully in her pocket, and the helmet glinting beneath the bulb. She was standing at the edge of something bigger than she'd ever imagined, her late husband's world opening wide before her. But Victor's voice echoed in her mind, slick and certain. Everyone says that at first. The smell of old paper hit her first. While reorganizing the back office of the garage, a room that looked more like a storage closet for forgotten invoices, Sandra stumbled across a cardboard box wedged behind a filing cabinet. Dust billowed as she pulled it free, coughing into her sleeve. Inside were photo albums, leather corners cracked with age. She eased one open, the plastic pages sticking faintly before releasing. Her heart tightened. It was them. Her and her husband, not in their 40s when they married, not in the last gray years when illness had slowed him, but in their 20s. Grease on their hands, hair wild from summer heat, bent over a half-assembled motorcycle in a friend's garage. In every frame, she was laughing, her younger self radiant in the grime. He'd kept these, hidden them away, not for Riley, not for anyone else. Just preserved. Waiting. Sandra flipped another page and another. They told a story she'd half forgotten. Weekends spent chasing parts. Evenings spent sketching engine ideas on diner napkins. Her handwriting sometimes scrawled in the margins. Beneath the albums she found notebooks. Dozens of them, bound in cracked leather, the spines softened from years of handling. Mechanical journals. His mechanical journals. Her hands trembled as she opened the first one. Sketches filled the pages. Gears, exhaust systems, aerodynamic outlines of bodies that might one day race down highways. In the margins, notes in his hand. Sandra says the curve should flow smoother. She's right. Another read. Sandra hears the misfire before I do. Sharp ears. Her throat tightened. He hadn't just worked alone. He'd written her into the process, even when she didn't realize he was listening. She had been in the margins of his legacy all along. By the time Dana arrived that afternoon, Sandra was still surrounded by open journals, her fingertips blackened with graphite smudges. Dana leaned over her shoulder, whistling low. Well, damn. This is gold. Literal provenance. If anyone ever questions you, these journals are the record. Sandra blinked back tears and forced a smile. Feels like he's still talking to me. Dana squeezed her shoulder. In a way, he is. She gestured toward the work floor. And speaking of legacies, the Superbird's coming along faster than expected. The restorers think we'll be ready for the expo sooner than planned. Sandra rose, brushing dust from her jeans. She glanced out at the gleaming bones of the car, still skeletal, but every day looking less like scrap and more like destiny. That evening, the digital war flared again. Her phone buzzed with a new post. Riley, venom dripping from every word. Stepmoms ruin families. And garages. The bile in Sandra's stomach churned as she read the hundreds of comments stacked beneath. Strangers weighed in, some jeering, others defending her. The whole thing turning her life into public spectacle. But this time, she didn't just close the laptop. She hit print. Page after page churned from the machine, the ink smell sharp in the air. Every insult, every lie, every desperate attempt Riley made to weaponize her role in the family. Sandra stacked them neatly, feeding them into a binder labeled, simply, Evidence, for court. Later, she sat at the kitchen table with the binder at her elbow and her laptop open to the state licensing portal. The form blinked at her. Application for collector-dealer license. Her cursor hovered for a long moment. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration. She typed her name, the words steady, each keystroke louder than the last. When she hit submit, her pulse steadied. Sandra Monroe, collector, owner, no longer an intruder in her husband's shadow, but a player in her own right. The night outside was still, but her phone buzzed once more. This time, it wasn't Riley. New message, Victor Choi. She opened it with a knot in her stomach. Only 6 words, perfectly polite, perfectly chilling. You'll sell. Everyone does, eventually. The day of the Detroit Collectors Expo dawned cold and electric. Sandra stood backstage, the din of the convention floor rumbling through the steel beams overhead. Beyond the curtains, the cavernous hall glowed with fluorescent light. Cameras flashing in bursts, the air alive with the hum of money and admiration. Beside her, the Dodge Daytona gleamed like a jewel. Its cherry red body polished to a mirror shine, the towering wing slicing the air with authority. Beside it, the resurrected Superbird prototype sat in pearlescent white, lines sharp and impossible, as if dragged back from myth. Together, they looked less like cars and more like declarations. Sandra smoothed her blazer, palms damp. She could almost hear her husband's voice. These machines are alive when people see them, when they feel them. Then the curtain rose. A wall of light and sound crashed over her. The crowd surged forward, hundreds of phones lifting, the air splitting with applause. Reporters jostled for angles, collectors craned their necks, and cameras swept in arcs that made her dizzy. Dana gave her a subtle nod from the sidelines. Go. Sandra stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking against the polished floor. For a moment she was terrified she might faint. Then the roar of the crowd steadied, turned into something she could ride like a current. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer boomed, the Monroe Legacy Collection, a pristine 1969 Dodge Daytona, and a one-of-three 1970 Plymouth Superbird prototype, fully restored. The crowd erupted again. Sandra caught sight of faces twisted with awe, mouths moving soundlessly, fingers pointing like they couldn't believe their own eyes. She reached the podium, fingers brushing the microphone, when a commotion flared at the front. Riley. He shoved past a photographer, his voice cutting through the din. This is a fraud. Those cars belong to me. Gasps rippled. Security surged forward, but Riley climbed halfway onto the stage before two men grabbed his arms. Sandra's stomach twisted, but she stood still, watching as he thrashed, spitting curses. She stole them. She's nothing but a... The microphone squealed as security dragged him back, his voice swallowed by boos and murmurs. The crowd's energy shifted, no longer uncertain, but protective. On her side. Sandra lifted her chin. That young man, she said evenly, would have you believe these cars are his birthright. But these machines... She gestured toward the gleaming beasts behind her, were entrusted to me by the man who built them. He gave me more than metal. He gave me a story to finish. The silence after was brief but absolute. Then applause thundered, filling the hall like a wave breaking over stone. Sandra swallowed hard, forcing back tears, and let the current carry her. When the show wound down and the cars were moved to a cordoned display, Sandra finally allowed herself to breathe. That was when Victor Choi appeared. He was shorter than she expected, immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his hair slick with precision. His eyes, however, gleamed with hunger. Mrs. Monroe, he said smoothly, extending a hand. Victor. Finally. Sandra shook it cautiously, her skin prickling at the coolness of his palm. You've made quite the entrance, Victor continued, his gaze never leaving the cars. Two legends, side by side, breathtaking. I'll spare you the flattery and get to the point. He slipped a card from his pocket, sliding it into her hand like a magician's trick. On it, his private number. $2.2 million, he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. For both cars, immediate transfer and... He paused, savoring the moment. A seat on my collector's board. Influence, resources, protection. Everything you'll need against the boy and his petty tantrums. Sandra stared at him, her pulse stuttering. The number alone was staggering, but the offer of power, of legitimacy in a world she barely understood, was something else entirely. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Everyone has a price. The question is whether you recognize yours before the wolves tear you apart. Victor's card still burned in Sandra's palm as the applause from the expo faded into echoes. The numbers swirled in her head. 2.2 million. A seat at the boardroom table, legitimacy carved with a pen stroke. For a moment the temptation pressed hard against her ribs, but when Victor leaned in, voice silk over steel. Think carefully, Mrs. Monroe. You don't get opportunities like this twice. She heard the weight of her husband's letter instead. This was always yours. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. She slid the card back into his hand. Not for sale? Victor's smile faltered, just for a flicker, before his polished mask returned. Then perhaps a display, a museum, something that lets the world admire while you pretend to own. Sandra's lips curved, not quite a smile. That, Mr. Choi, is a conversation I'll start, not one you'll finish. Within days, whispers of Riley's public meltdown at the expo began to curdle into headlines. Local blogs ran with phrases like "heir unhinged" and "stepmother stands firm," while forum threads replayed shaky cell phone footage of him being hauled off stage. The comments were merciless, and this time, not in his favor. Sandra scrolled late at night, the glow of her laptop bathing her in cold light. Comment after comment shredded Riley's credibility. He wasn't the son preserving his father's legacy. He was the spoiled man trying to steal it. His rants online only made it worse, especially when people began digging up his half-hearted work history and string of unpaid debts. Her phone buzzed, a message from Lamar, handled. Cease and desist sent to 3 sites repeating Riley's lies. They'll scrub within 48 hours. Sandra exhaled, tension she hadn't realized she was carrying easing from her shoulders. For once, Riley wasn't winning the narrative. That weekend, Dana showed up at the garage with something wrapped in brown paper. She set it on the workbench with ceremony, then stepped back. Open it. Sandra peeled away the wrapping to reveal a wooden plaque, the grain polished smooth. Etched into the surface were words that stopped her breath. Built with heart. Driven by truth. Her eyes stung. Dana. It's not for the cars, Dana said quickly. It's for you. You've taken every hit and kept building. That's what matters. Sandra traced the lettering with her fingertips, the words grounding her more firmly than any offer of money or influence. She smiled through the ache in her chest. Then let's hang it where Riley can't miss it. The next morning, Sandra drove out to the cemetery. The air was brittle with late autumn, leaves crumbling underfoot as she walked to her husband's grave. She carried a framed photograph tucked under her arm. The Superbird, newly finished, gleaming under the expo lights. She knelt, the damp earth seeping through her jeans. I wish you'd told me sooner, she whispered, her voice breaking. But maybe you knew I wouldn't believe until I saw it myself. She set the photo against the headstone, the glass catching a shaft of pale sunlight. For a long while she sat in silence. The weight of grief pressing soft and heavy, but no longer unbearable. When she finally stood, brushing dirt from her palms, she felt steadier. The legacy wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. As Sandra returned to her car, her phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line froze her in her tracks. Proposal for long-term exhibit. Detroit Motor Legends Museum. She tapped it open, the screen glowing bright in the dim air. Inside, a formal offer to house both the Daytona and the Superbird as the centerpiece of a new wing. Not for sale, not gone. Preserved. Under her name. Her breath caught. The museum wanted her collection. The contract from Detroit's Motor Legends Museum lay on Sandra's desk, its embossed letterhead catching the morning light. The words "permanent installation" seemed almost unreal, as if she'd conjured them out of some late-night fantasy. Yet here they were, crisp and binding. The Monroe Legacy Collection, secured for display under her name. She signed with a steady hand. No dollar signs this time. No vultures circling for ownership. just preservation, pride, and her husband's work etched into history. Weeks later, the museum unveiled the new wing. The hall was sleek and reverent, walls lined with enlarged photographs chronicling the build. Her husband at a workbench, Dana holding a blueprint. Sandra herself captured candidly in a photo Maggie had insisted be included. And at the center, under glowing white lights, the Dodge Daytona and the Superbird gleamed like twin crowns. Polished to perfection, they looked untouchable, every curve and angle drawing gasps as visitors pressed forward. A bronze plaque stood between them, its engraving simple and final, the Monroe Legacy Collection built with heart, driven by truth. Sandra stood just behind the velvet rope, a quiet storm of cameras flashing around her. The pride swelling in her chest was nearly unbearable. This wasn't about ownership or money anymore. It was about permanence, about legacy. Predictably, Riley tried to claw back the spotlight. 2 days before the opening, Sandra's attorney forwarded her yet another court filing, Riley Monroe versus estate of Thomas Monroe. This time, his claim was emotional distress, alleging that seeing the cars displayed caused him undue pain as the rightful heir. Lamar met Sandra in his office, the complaint sitting between them like a bad joke. He skimmed the pages, lips curling with disdain. "This is flimsy. Judges don't tolerate tantrums dressed up as lawsuits. It'll be tossed before it breathes." And it was. The case never made it past its first hearing. Riley's attempt at retribution only cemented his humiliation, news outlets now running headlines like Monroe heir's last gasp fails in court. Sandra read them with something approaching pity, but only almost. Opening night arrived with a velvet ribbon stretched across the museum entrance. The press gathered in clusters, their lenses trained on Sandra as she stepped to the podium. Her palms tingled, not from nerves, but from anticipation. She adjusted the microphone, her voice calm and resonant. "These cars aren't just machines. They are memory, grit, and promise. My husband poured his life into them, and in the process, gave me more than I knew I had. He gave me the courage to carry it forward." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. She glanced at the polished hoods behind her, catching her reflection warped in the Daytona's curve. This collection doesn't belong to greed, or to those who would strip it for profit. It belongs to Detroit. To everyone who knows the sound of an engine can be a kind of heartbeat. The audience erupted in applause, loud and unrestrained. From the second row, Maggie Ruiz cupped her hands around her mouth and hollered, "That's my girl!" Her voice carried above the rest, fierce and unashamed, and Sandra couldn't help laughing through her tears. The ribbon was cut, and the flood began. Families filed in, teenagers craning their necks to snap selfies, old-timers wiping their eyes as they circled the cars. Flashbulbs went off like fireworks. Some visitors leaned down to read the plaque, whispering the words aloud, "Built with heart, driven by truth." Sandra stood at the edge watching strangers line up, smiling as they posed beside the Daytona's wing or the Superbird's nose. Her husband's work was no longer hidden under dust and tarps. It was alive, part of the city. Dana sidled up, her voice soft. "Look at them. He'd never believe this scene if he could see it." Sandra nodded, throat tight. "Maybe he does." Sandra was combing through another of the mechanical journals when a folded sheaf of paper slipped free and fluttered to the floor. She crouched, frowning as she picked it up. It wasn't lined notebook paper. It was crisp, watermarked, stamped in the corner with the seal of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Her pulse quickened. She spread it across the workbench. The title read, "Hybrid Transmission System, Monroe Design," dated just 2 months before his death. Sandra's breath caught. A design not for restoration, not for the past, but for the future. That afternoon, she sat in Lamar's office, the patent stretched out between them like a map to buried treasure. Lamar adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing as he skimmed the diagrams and signatures. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "This isn't a draft, it's registered, filed, pending final approval when he passed, which means—" He looked at Sandra, expression sharp with meaning. "The rights transferred to you with the estate. This is yours." Sandra's chest swelled and broke in the same instant. For months, she'd been fighting simply to preserve what her husband had built. Now here was proof he hadn't just been looking backward at legends. He'd been designing forward, trusting that she'd hold it. Her voice wavered. "Lamar, what does this mean, legally?" "It means," Lamar said, tapping the patent with his finger, "that every company sniffing around hybrid innovations will want a piece, and if you play this right, Sandra, you're sitting on millions." Dana's eyes nearly popped out of her head when Sandra told her. "A transmission design? From him? Sandra, this isn't just collector's territory. This is tech, industry, real disruption." She pulled out her phone, scrolling furiously. "I know a team. A Detroit startup working on sustainable drivetrains. Scrappy but serious. Let me set up a meeting. They'll lose their minds." Sandra hesitated. She was just learning to navigate car expos and museum contracts. But this was different. Bigger. Her husband had left her not just the past, but the keys to the future. 3 days later, Sandra sat across from two wide-eyed engineers in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown. They pored over the patent like it was scripture, firing questions faster than she could answer. Dana fielded the technical ones, her voice animated, her hands sketching invisible diagrams in the air. Finally, one of the engineers leaned back, his face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Monroe, this design is a decade ahead of where most companies are. If we can license it, we can bring it to market within 3 years." Sandra folded her hands in her lap, her husband's letter echoing in her mind. "You'll know what to do." She nodded slowly. "Then let's talk licensing." News of the patent spread faster than she anticipated. Blogs picked it up, industry forums buzzed, and like clockwork, Riley came crawling. He showed up at the garage one evening, his voice almost unrecognizable, stripped of venom, soft and pleading. "Sandra," he said, standing in the doorway, eyes darting to the cars, the journals, anything but her face. "Look, I was wrong, okay? I've been angry, but this patent, it's different. It's our future. Let's partner." Dad would have wanted. Sandra turned her back before he could finish. The sound of her footsteps on the concrete was louder than his words. She walked straight past him, locked the office door behind her, and didn't look back. For once, she didn't need to argue. His desperation was answer enough. That night, her phone buzzed again. Victor Choi. The message was short. "I hear you've found something valuable. My lawyers can protect it. Call me before others make their move." Sandra stared at the screen, unease prickling under her skin. Protection sounded less like an offer and more like a warning. She set the phone down, her husband's journals stacked neatly beside her, the patent gleaming under the lamp. Every step forward seemed to widen the battlefield. The conference room was glass-walled and humming with tension. A city skyline glittered beyond the windows, but Sandra barely noticed. Papers were spread before her. Contracts, projections, numbers that looked almost unreal. 3.1 million, the lead engineer said, sliding the signature page toward her. Upfront licensing, plus a royalty schedule once production begins. We'll credit Monroe Motor Works as the originating design firm. Sandra stared at the bold typeface of her husband's last name, Monroe Motor Works, and felt her throat tighten. For decades it had been scribbled in margins, whispered in his shop, treated as fantasy. Now it was stamped into a legal document, weighty and undeniable. Her hand didn't shake when she signed. The money landed 2 days later. Numbers that had once seemed like fairy tales now blinked from her bank account, but Sandra's first move wasn't indulgence. She called Lamar. "I want a foundation," she said firmly. "Scholarships. Training programs for girls who want to learn the craft but never get the chance." He believed in passing it on. "I'll make sure they can." Within weeks, the Monroe Women in Mechanics Initiative was announced. Applications flooded in. Young women writing about engines and racing dreams, about being told they didn't belong in garages. Sandra read every line with tears blurring her vision. Her husband had left her machines. She would leave opportunities. Meanwhile, Riley's storm finally caught up to him. The binder Sandra had built, page after page of his smear posts, threats, and lies, was now in the hands of Lamar and a prosecutor. One morning, a knock came at Riley's apartment door. He opened it to find a process server, a stack of papers thrust into his hand: defamation, harassment, damages pending. Within hours, forums lit up with screenshots of the filing. Riley had gone too far, and now the law was eating him alive. Sandra didn't gloat. But when Maggie called to cackle down the line, "About damn time somebody muzzled that boy," Sandra couldn't help the small smile that crept through. At the garage, Dana's role expanded until it was no longer avoidable. She was there at dawn, organizing restorers, answering emails, fielding calls. "You don't need me signing off on every carburetor order anymore," Sandra told her one afternoon, the smell of oil hanging heavy between them. Dana smirked. "Guess not. But you need someone who lives and breathes this, Sandra. Someone who can keep Monroe Motor Works moving while you're fielding museums and patents." Sandra studied her friend, the grease on her sleeves, the fierce steadiness in her eyes, and knew it was true. She grabbed a sheet of letterhead, scribbled quickly, and pressed the page into Dana's hand. "Kuo. Monroe Motor Works." Dana blinked, then laughed, a choked, joyous sound. "Hell, Sandra, you just made me official." The garage itself was next. What had once been a crumbling tomb of rust and shadows now buzzed with restoration crews, architects, and city planners. Sandra had filed for historic status and won, meaning Monroe Motor Works would stand not just as a business, but as a landmark. Steel beams rose where graffiti once clung. The roof was rebuilt, skylights flooding the workspace with light. The old brick was scrubbed and sealed, but a mural was commissioned for the outer wall. Sandra and her husband side by side, tools in hand, a half-assembled car between them. For the first time, she didn't just feel like a caretaker of what he'd left. She felt like a builder in her own right. Then came the call that changed everything. It was late evening, the hum of work still drifting from the garage floor below, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Monroe?" The voice was formal, warm, but precise. "This is the Automotive Innovators Council. We're reaching out to inform you. You've been nominated for Innovator of the Year. Your work in restoration, preservation, and new design licensing has set a new benchmark for the industry." Sandra's heart stopped. Her knees nearly buckled. She clutched the desk to stay upright, the words replaying in her head. Innovator of the Year. Not widow. Not stepmother. Not relics keeper. Innovator. "Are you sure?" she whispered, the old insecurities clawing up despite everything. The caller chuckled gently. "Quite sure, Mrs. Monroe. The nomination will be announced publicly next week." "Congratulations." The line went dead, leaving her in silence. The morning of the reopening dawned bright, the air sharp with early spring. Sandra stood at the edge of Monroe Motor Works, hands stuffed into her jacket pockets, watching as the last banners were strung across the gates. The garage no longer sagged under the weight of years. Fresh brickwork gleamed in the sunlight. Steel beams arched proud and unbent. Glass windows reflected the skyline instead of grime. Above the entrance stretched the mural. She and her husband side by side, captured forever with wrenches in hand, the half-built car between them glowing with color. Her chest tightened. It didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt alive. By noon, the street outside was blocked off for the community car show. Local families streamed in, teenagers snapping photos in front of the Daytona's towering wing, old-timers craning their necks to peek under hoods. Food trucks lined the curb, the smell of barbecue and roasted peanuts tangling in the air. Sandra walked the rows of polished cars, nodding to owners who tipped their hats, shaking hands with collectors who had flown in just to see what Detroit was suddenly buzzing about. Everywhere she went, people said her name, sometimes with awe, sometimes with familiarity, always with respect. Inside, the new engine rooms opened for tours. The first group in line was a pack of teenage girls from the local high school, wide-eyed and chattering as they filed past the benches. Sandra followed at a distance, listening as Dana guided them through. "This is where we test engines. This lift, brand new, state-of-the-art. And that corner? That's where Monroe Motor Works started," Dana said, pointing to a preserved workbench scarred with decades of grease and gouges. One of the girls ran her fingers lightly along the edge. "You mean, this is where it all happened?" Dana smiled. "This is where it began." The girls clustered around the Superbird, their voices tumbling over one another in excitement. Sandra watched their faces. The same wonder she'd once felt staring at blueprints, now reflected in a new generation. Later, Sandra slipped outside for air. She stood beneath the mural, gazing up at her painted likeness. It should have felt strange, seeing herself immortalized on brick. Instead, it felt right. For the first time since the papers had landed on her kitchen table, she felt not like a placeholder, not like someone guarding her husband's secrets, but like the rightful owner of this space. Dana appeared at her side, eyes glassy. "He'd be proud of you," she said softly. "More than proud. He'd be... Hell, Sandra, he'd be floored." Sandra's throat closed, her gaze never leaving the mural. "For so long I thought he kept this from me. Now I think maybe he just wanted me to find it when I was ready." Dana squeezed her hand. Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. The day stretched long into evening. Lanterns lit the street. Music pulsed from speakers. Children darted between rows of cars. At one point, Maggie Ruiz grabbed Sandra in a hug so fierce it left her ribs aching. "Look at you," Maggie crowed. "You built something none of them can ever take away." Sandra laughed through tears, her heart aching with gratitude. Near dusk, as the crowd thinned and engines rumbled away, Sandra stepped back toward the street. That was when she saw it. A car idling at the far corner, Riley behind the wheel. He didn't get out. He didn't wave. His face was pale, unreadable through the windshield. For a long moment, the engine's low growl mixed with the fading hum of celebration. Then he shifted into gear and rolled past, unnoticed by most, forgotten by many. Sandra didn't flinch. She watched until the taillights vanished, her chest steady. For once, his presence didn't sting. He was no longer a threat. He was a ghost. The ballroom was cathedral high, chandeliers glittering like constellations overhead. Rows upon rows of chairs stretched to the back wall, every seat filled with collectors, engineers, industry leaders, and reporters. Cameras stood in clusters along the aisles, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Sandra stood behind the curtain, her note cards trembling slightly in her hand. She could hear the hum of the crowd, their chatter, the shuffling of programs, the occasional cough swallowed by the vast space. Dana touched her elbow. "You've got this," she whispered. Sandra managed to smile. Funny, that's what he used to say before every fight with Riley. The announcer's voice boomed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Innovator of the Year nominee, Sandra Monroe of Monroe Motorworks. Applause thundered. Sandra stepped into the light. The podium loomed, but she found her footing quickly. She looked out at the sea of faces, some expectant, some skeptical, all watching. The weight of the moment pressed down, but instead of buckling, she let it root her. "I never expected to be here," she began, her voice steady, carrying. "A year ago, I was a widow standing in front of a garage I didn't want. It smelled like rust and regret. I thought I'd inherited a burden. I thought I was stepping into a fight I couldn't win." The audience hushed, leaning forward. But that garage wasn't a tomb. It was a map. A map my husband left behind, of what he built, what he dreamed, and what he believed I could carry on. And along the way, I realized something. The value wasn't just in the cars. It was in the people, the mentors, the apprentices, the neighbors who refused to let me back down. It was in every girl who picked up a wrench for the first time because someone finally told her she could. Murmurs of agreement rippled. Sandra glanced at Dana in the wings, at Maggie sitting proudly in the second row, at Lamar stone-faced but nodding slowly. She took a breath, the final words she'd been holding close sparking in her chest. This all started with a locked door and a broken heart. Silence. Then the crowd erupted. Applause roared, cameras flashed. People surged to their feet. The sound crashed over her like a wave, loud, unrelenting, but no longer frightening. It lifted her. Sandra bowed her head slightly, fighting tears, and stepped back from the podium. Hours later, long after the speeches and handshakes and photographs, Sandra returned home. The garage, her garage, was alive with motion. Lights glowed from every corner, the clang of tools rang like music, voices rose and fell in easy rhythm. Apprentices hunched over open engines. Dana barked instructions while grease streaked her sleeves. Maggie perched on a stool, sipping coffee and heckling everyone in sight. Sandra walked slowly through it all, her heels clicking against the polished concrete. She trailed her fingers along a newly painted wall, across the cool steel of a restored fender. The air smelled of oil and polish and possibility. This was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a heartbeat, steady and strong. Dana emerged from the office, a leather-bound journal in her hands. She pressed it into Sandra's palms. "Found this tucked in the last drawer of his desk. I think he meant it for you." Sandra opened it carefully. Inside, sketches sprawled across the pages, unfinished designs, notes written in his slanting hand. And tucked in the back cover, a smaller page folded in two. She unfolded it slowly. One line, written in his careful, deliberate script. "I knew you'd finish it." Her chest cracked open. The weight she had carried since that first letter, since the tarp came off the Daytona, finally loosened. She closed her eyes, clutching the journal against her heart. Later, she stepped outside, the night air cool on her skin. From the doorway, she looked out over the property. The mural glowed under the floodlights. The hum of engines drifted through the walls. Laughter spilled into the street. Noise, tools, stories, life. Sandra smiled, her voice steady. "Sure," carrying into the dark. "He left me a garage. I left the world a legacy."